Welcome to The Shelves, which is a series conceived by the research group of Filosofia Antica at Torino, that is by myself and especially, I'd say, Giulia De Cesaris and Arianna Piazzalunga. And so let me first share with you the next events we'll have. So today, I hope you can see the flyer. By the way, we are pretty happy with this image, which is by an Italian artist, contemporary artist, Pizzicannella. So today we present music and philosophy in the Roman Empire, and then we'll have on next Thursdays, on March 25th, Gretchen and Reydams-Schils Chalcidius presented. And it is a pleasure to have her with us today as a speaker, and of course next week as the author of the presented volume. Then we'll have on April 1st the presentation of a book leading us towards modern philosophy as well. So Christian Platonism, encompassing papers on ancient, medieval and modern philosophy on Christian Platonism indeed. And then we'll have the last event on April 8th. We'll present authority and authoritative texts in the Platonist tradition. And it is important for me and for the other editors of this volume to announce that that event and the book itself are dedicated to Anna Maria Ioppolo, who sadly, as you know, passed away last December. So this is our plan. The series is supported by, first by the Turin University and especially by the FINO, which is the Philosophy PhD curriculum of Turin, Genoa, Vercelli, and Pavia. It is a curriculum which is entirely in English. So please, if you want to apply, or if you have students willing to apply for a PhD in philosophy, please do consider Turin as a place where to apply. We would very much welcome people from abroad. Not only in ancient philosophy, of course, all areas of philosophy are represented. And then I would like to thank very much CUP, Cambridge University Press, and especially Michael Sharp for supporting this series from the very beginning, for providing fundamental support from all points of view. And so please, Michael, I would now let you announce the discount and in general, if you have anything on the series and CUP.
Well, I won't. All I'll just say is that since I've already said a few words, that again, thank you very much for organising this, Federico. It's a great idea, and that for this and all the books presented, if anybody would like to buy a copy, if they let me know, I can arrange for you to have a 40% discount. Yeah, I mean, obviously they're in hardback at the moment, so not mainly aimed at library purchase, but hopefully a 40% discount will make them a bit more affordable if you would like to have a copy sooner. So as I say, just email me. I think Federico,
I can put
well, a lot of you know my email address, but or you can find it easily on the CUP website. But anyway, just send me an email and I can arrange for that. There's a small postage charge as well, but apart from that, hopefully no other. I think we've sorted out our supply issues to the EU as a result of the dreadful Brexit, but so I hope there'll be no problems on that front. So anyway, so without further ado, let me move back to Federico and the main business today. So.
Thank you so much, Michael. And Michael's address is in the chat. If you want to copy it, you can find it there. And so just two words on the idea. I mean, why book presentations? We just, inquired into ways in which this weird, I must say, way of doing scholarship could be exploited. And one of the ways we discovered is gathering people, authors, editors, speakers, and discussants together in order to have a very quick discussion of recently published books. So this is the reason why we opted for books presentations. We selected, of course, then some leading titles at Cambridge University Press. So this is, in fact, everything I had to say. The last thing is thank you to the authors, to the speakers, and to all participants for joining us in this event. We'll have now a short introduction to the book, to the genealogy of the book by Francesco, my friend and co-editor, who is co-organizing this event with me on behalf of the Department of Civilizations and Forms of Knowledge of the University of Pisa. And then we'll have the talks by our two speakers, Gretchen Reydams-Schils and George Karamanolis. And then we'll just open the discussion. So please, Francesco.
Yes, thank you and good afternoon. I would like to say just a few words about the origin of this book, about how this book was conceived and its general aim. This book grew out of an international conference entitled "The Harmony of Reason: Music and Philosophy from the Early Imperial Age to Late Antiquity," which was held at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Pisa in 2016. And this conference was part of a research project devoted to the relationship between music and philosophy in antiquity. And this project was supported by the Italian Ministry of Education, Universities and Research. Some of the papers presented at the conference became the backbone of this book, while other papers were added upon invitation. As editors, we try to provide a picture as comprehensive and systematic as possible of the relationship, of the interplay between music and philosophy in this period, from the early imperial age to late antiquity. And so the generally speaking, the aim of this book is to shed light on the different ways in which musical notions played a crucial role in the philosophical debate of this period and contribute to shape the content of this philosophical debate. I take this opportunity to thank once again all those who contributed to this project, especially the authors, of course, and the team of Cambridge University Press for the support. Today, the book will be presented by two speakers that I have the great pleasure to introduce. Professor Gretchen Reydams-Schils and Professor George Karamanolis. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation and for being here today. Gretchen Reydams-Schils is a professor within the program of liberal studies at Notre University. She's a specialist in the traditions of Platonism and Stoicism. Among her publications in the fields, I would like to mention Demiurge and Providence, Stoic and Platonist readings of Plato's Timaeus, Brepol's 1999, and the latest, Chalcidius on Plato's Timaeus, Greek Philosophy, Latin Reception, and Christian Context, Cambridge University Press 2020, And this book will be presented in the second session of the series, The Shelves, on March 25th. George Karamanolis is professor of ancient philosophy at the University of Vienna. His main areas of specialization are Platonism and Christian philosophy. He is the author of Plato and Aristotle in Agreement, Platonism on Aristotle from Antiochus to Porphyry, Oxford University Press, 2006. And the other book, The Philosophy of Early Christianity, Routledge, 2013. I'm delighted to say that some of the authors of our volume are here today with us. Brem de Mulder, Giovanna Giardina, and Christina Hoenig, Dominic Comara, Harold Tarrant, and Mate Beresh. Thank you very much for participating in this event, and thanks again for contributing to this project. Unfortunately, Alexandra Michalewski was not able to attend. I think that that's all I wanted to say in this brief introduction. So I leave now the floor to the speakers, and I just want to add that after the presentation, we will have some time for discussion. So enjoy the presentation and the discussion.
All right. Can you hear me? Yep. I'll start with getting us going. And of course, I too want to take a moment to thank Michael Sharp and Cambridge University Press for really the tremendous efforts that they're making to keep our discipline alive. And you know, it's the books that you're bringing out are really vital in that respect. And it's not obvious, you know, to find a good publisher for this kind of work. So I'm deeply grateful, and I want to express my regrets for all the logistical challenges that you've had to deal with as a result of Brexit. I mean, if things aren't difficult enough, you know, you have to deal with this obstacle course. Then I want to start by congratulating Francesco and Federico for having put together a really marvelous volume. And I think George will agree with me how difficult it is actually to summarize the papers, because they're so rich, they take us in so many different directions, and that's always a good sign when you know, a volume will generate that much thought. Before I hand it over to George, I just wanted to remind us that thematically, the book is looking at music in 4 different areas. First is ontology and theology. I mean, what can music, and by extension, mathematicals, tell us about the structure of reality, but also the vertical structure of reality, the levels of perfection. The second main area is cosmology. What's the role of music and mathematics in the ordering of the universe? The third main area is epistemology, because in a way that's something that is primary to all these other forms of inquiry. And that really is the question, to which extent mathematicals can in fact tell us something about the structure of reality. So in that sense, that's the really foundational question. And then finally, ethics. What's the role of music and mathematics in reorienting human beings in whichever way they need to be reoriented? So those are the sort of thematic approaches, which in themselves indicate, of course, how central a topic this is in the ancient philosophy in the 6 centuries. It's quite an impressive range that this book is covering. So I'll hand it over to George now. He'll do the first 7 papers, and then I'll talk about the second half of the book. George? You need to unmute yourself, George.
Sorry. Thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting me to present. also want to start by thanking the editors for inviting me to present. I would like to join Francesco in congratulating, and Gretchen in congratulating Michael Sharps and Cambridge University Press for making such an enormous effort to promote ancient philosophy. They have recently published a number of many interesting books on ancient philosophy. Among those also the one on De Mundo, the Iranian commentary, I have edited with Pablo Gregorich. But of course, the book on music and philosophy, which I would like to present today. And let me sort of get into it now. Gretchen already mentioned the areas in which music is playing an important role in the philosophical debates in the Roman times, namely in cosmology, epistemology, ethics, and ontology. And that starts, part of it starts already in the Hellenistic age. The main issue becomes the epistemological and ethical value of music. We find that in the Hellenistic age, but in the Roman Empire, these two aspects continue to play a role, the epistemological and ethical value of music, but also one important, two further areas are added, the cosmological bearing of music and the ontological one. But I would also like to sort of distinguish here two ways in which music is sort of present in the book and sort of discussed in the book. Namely, on the one hand, music as an analogy model, and we find that especially in the cosmological debates, namely God as the harmonizer, the world as a harmony, the soul has a harmony, and so on. Sort of music and harmony as analogy model on the one hand, and music sort of in that sense that music plays sort of a paradigmatic role, and music as a proper object of study. And if for those who have looked at them, you find some papers discussing music in the first way, namely in the paradigmatic sense as an analogy. For instance, Federico's paper on cosmology, Laura's article on ontology, Dominique's paper on ethics, and other papers such as that of Andrew Barker and Mattia Veres, discussing music as an object of study, as a music in sort of the strict sense of the word. Let me, that of course these two are not sort of entirely distinct and separate, because the music in the sense of something that has harmony contains sort of this, implies a sense of something that is shaped by reason, something that is orderly, and that sense is very important and bears on how music is appreciated, and also in the paradigmatic faction that is discussed in some papers. Let me start with the first paper. My aim is to bring out and highlight some central points of the papers. I cannot do justice to the complexity and richness of these papers. Well, the first paper of Carlos Levy on Philo starts by highlighting the fact that there is very little work done on the historical area between sort of Cicero and Philo, and then goes on to discuss how Philo adopts the Stoic model of the scala naturae, and he finds that in several works of Philo, but this is not the entire story, because Philo, of course, does not want to is not content with just the Stoic model of the scala naturae, which implies kind of materialist metaphysics and immanent understanding of God, but he wants to integrate, of course, the transcendent God of Scripture, and he does that by adopting the musical model. So the way Carlos Levy sets out to show how this musical model is appropriated in order to show that music evades the order of sensible world and is a path to transcendence, the realm of God. And this is sort of an ontological area that needs to be added to the scala naturae, the realm of transcendent God. And one, of course, can go further and think along these lines whether music as order without involving matter refers us to the heavenly order, such as, for instance, the order of thoughts in God's intellect. Then we find a set or a group of papers on cosmology, namely cosmology is a big issue, a big topic in Middle Platonism. It starts with Plutarch and is becoming an important topic in all other Middle Platonists. So they want to emphasize how God, the demiurge, is setting order in the world, how God is the harmonizer. And the first of those papers is that of Bram de Mulder on music and Plutarch's Platonic cosmos. So the paper talks about the role of music in Plutarch's cosmology, and especially highlights the comparison of musical harmony with the divine one. We find that especially in Plutarch's work, De Anime Procreatione in Timaeo, the generation of the soul in the Timaeus. So this is one important aspect, namely how the musical harmony is sort of a model of understanding the divine harmony and the music of the heavenly spheres, namely the harmony of the world. But there is also another important aspect of music, namely the therapeutic effect of music. So it is not only that the world is set in such a way, namely in a harmonious, orderly, reasonable, rational way. This has also repercussions about how we sort of should stay in that world, and sort of music as sort of a representation of order and harmony has a therapeutic effect on us, and it can restore order in the irrational part of the soul. It's interesting how we find this sort of musical analogies in the work of Plutarch, and how these two are sort of combined. Federico's paper elaborates on the theme of cosmic harmony, namely harmony as a cosmological model. The idea here is that the demiurge regulates the world like a musical blending of rhythms and harmonies, and the world soul has an harmonic structure which conditions heavenly motions. So one way of understanding the order and harmony of the world is by introducing this sort of musical analogy. But Federico discusses how this notion of cosmic harmony is dealt with by Middle Platonists, and he distinguishes two ways, namely God's direct harmonization of the world's components. We know that Middle Platonists debate how exactly we need to understand creation or the world's coming into being. So there are those who, like Plutarch, for instance, who understand the world's coming into being in terms of sort of God's direct intervention and God's direct generation of the world. So the analogy of harmony is taken here in one way. But there are those, like sort of Taurus, for instance, who understand the world's coming into being in a different sense, that namely without God being directly intervening, and without God directly putting the parts of the world in order. So I think that paper shows how the same analogy, the musical analogy of harmony being instilled in the world, can be understood still, can be used by Platonists, but still understood in different ways. Laura's paper is a very complex one, not only because it focuses on an ontological debate, but also because it sort of also looks in the history of many different schools, namely the Peripatetic, the Platonic, the Pythagorean, and from the point of view of Alexander. She starts by saying how that Alexander developed some hints by Aristotle, namely whether and to what extent certain approach to harmonia and symphonia can be used as a model for the ontological analysis of other beings. So symphonia and harmonia seem to be objects whose nature and properties are determined by the numbers that define them, and he calls that harmonia model. So what is the harmonia model? The harmonia model is the model according to which the nature and properties are determined by the numbers, the nature and properties of a certain entity. And so this, of course, is a model that we find in the Pythagorean tradition. And the question is, of course, how applicable this harmonia model is, and to what extent can be squared with the ontology, the Aristotelian ontology of substance being form. And she discusses sort of the ontological status of numbers and whether these, namely mathematical composition, what input, how much it bears in sort of how much it shapes ontological models. She stresses that Alexander has an interest in that, not only because he is opposing to Pythagoreanism, but also because he wants to react to materialism adopted by several peripatetics. It seems to me that one idea that is sort of important here, but I don't find it explicit, is that this harmonia model, according to which properties and natures of objects are determined by numbers, opposes the ontological model of Aristotle, according to which substance is a form, and everything in that, namely nature and properties, are determined by the form and not by sort of numbers, as in the harmonia model. So this paper is on the ontological application of music. Then I moved to a paper by Mate, which I found very illuminating. I must say I didn't know much about this discussion that Sextus carries out in the last book of his Adversus Mathematicus, namely against the musicologists. This is a paper which focuses on music as an object of study and not music as in this paradigmatic sense. As I said, I found the paper very illuminating, obviously because of my ignorance of that aspect of ancient philosophy. Sextus carries out a certain polemic to music. He claims that music does not contribute to happy life, but rather is harmful to it, and argues even that music does not exist. So you read that and you think, well, what terrible person this guy was. But then you read the paper and you see how, and also especially the relevant part of that Versus Mathematicus 6, how this polemic is carried out in that book. So basically, the idea is that Sextus argues against professors, against musicologists, I would say in our modern jargon, against those who study music from a dogmatic point of view, who want to sort of explain music in a certain sort of dogmatic way. Apparently, they sort of profess to be experts of music, and they have a view that music or musicology is a science. So the idea is, at the end, as if I understood well, not that the skeptic denies music or somehow disavows music and does not never enjoys music. The skeptic might enjoy music and can be moved by music. What the skeptic disputes is music under a certain dogmatic description, and wants also to criticize this dogmatic attitude to music in the same sense that the skeptic opposes any dogmatic description of other subjects and by other professors, namely dogmatists. The next paper is also on music as an object of study and not in the paradigmatic sense of music. It focuses on Ptolemy's harmonics. I found this paper also very interesting. It focuses on the science of harmonics, which studies the difference between sounds in respect of high and low pitch. So apparently, one could say these are sort of, Ptolemy is a guy who Sextus has in mind, one of those who study music in this sort of dogmatic sense and have views about the science of harmonics of music. What results can this science can bring us to? But the discussion, interestingly, as Andrew argues, is not merely musicological. So Ptolemy notes that the sense of hearing serves as maid servant of the theoretical and rational part of the soul. So it's the treatment, the discussion is about how the science of harmonics carries out its project of studying the difference between kinds of sounds. But at the end, we learned that the sense of hearing is also an object of the science of harmonics, and the sense of hearing is capable of judging the beauty of the perceived object, so can actually perceive, so to speak, the aesthetic value of the beauty of music. So differences of pitch are not mere differences of movement, are not mere sort of differences in terms of high and low note, but there are also differences of aesthetic perception. And this aesthetic element is also something that the science of harmonics investigates. The last paper I would like to present is the very interesting paper by Francesco on an area that is sort of dear to me, namely the early Christians, such as Clement and Origen. What is very interesting here is that we find once again a model that we very often find in those authors, namely, on the one hand, they reject a pagan idea or a pagan model, and on the other hand, they appropriate it, revise it, and employ it in their own way. And Francesco shows exactly how that happens. He focuses especially on Clement and Origen. In the Clement's Protrepticus is a very interesting work, and he shows there something that we know also from pictorial representations, namely Christ as a new Orpheus, namely Christ is sort of enchanting the world by the new song of the Christian message, and music in that sense is sort of the new message of Christianity, which both enchants and persuades. And then Origen also appropriates that sort of musical analogy. Origen very often takes over things from Clement, knows Clement well, but he uses the musical analogy in a different way. Namely, he presents scripture as a well-tuned instrument. The idea is that scripture, of course, is a composite of many parts, but these parts are very well organized and structured so that the end product is that of symphonia, of concordance, of harmony, and that highlights, of course, the unity and persuasive power of scripture. So scripture may be a composite of many parts, but that does not mean that it is sort of a variety of elements mingled together. It has a unity. It carries forth the same one message, the Christian message, and that is why it has a sort of a persuasive power. So the two ways of using this musical analogy both highlight the enchanting and persuasion that music has, but we find it applied in different ways, both very interestingly, and that shows, I think, well, that Christians, both who, as I said, generally reject pagan music. There was, of course, no Christian music at the time. On the other hand, employ the analogy of music in order to highlight the harmony of the Christian message and the persuasive power of Christ himself. That's all I wanted to say for the moment, and I want to pass now to Gretchen back to continue with the other papers, with the rest of the papers, papers 8 to 13.
All right. If you can stop share screen, then I can go to the. Now, as you will see, and this is the fun of doing sessions like these together, I have a very different approach from George. So I will not give you, I will not go through the issues paper by paper, but I thought that I would like to bring us back to some systematic questions inspired by the papers as they've been presented here. And I'm going to bring us back to some fundamental, basic questions that arise. Because one of the things that I often read, I mean, as you know, I've thought a lot about the reception of the Timaeus, is the way in which the Timaeus and other Platonic accounts are underdetermined. And it's precisely to the extent that they're underdetermined that they raise the need for answering questions that they themselves didn't necessarily answer. So I'm going to remind us of some very basic things from the Timaeus and then work from there. I mean, I'm taking the Timaeus here as my focal point, rather than the Republic, but, it should be clear that these other texts are at work as well. So when we first encounter the ordering influence of the demiurge in Plato's Timaeus, we get this general notion of taxes. The demiurge is going to impose taxes on disorder. Now, taxes, of course, is a very broad notion, right? I mean, we can think of order in many, many different ways. Once he comes to the end of his discussion of the third kind, it gets to be more specific. There we get the schematisto edicite kai arithmos. He shaped them with form and number. Now, edicy is not necessarily the notion of Platonic form, but that's of course a matter of debate. He's about to talk about the elements which have certain shapes. So now the taxis is made more specific, and this is what a lot of the commentators will then latch onto. It's that specific imposition of order. Now, the treatment of the musical ratios, the harmonic mean, of course, occurs in the composition of the world soul. But this in itself raises right away the overall role of mathematics. So some of the papers focused on music, others focused more on the role of mathematics in general. And just to remind us, the three areas where mathematics really comes up in the Timaeus is, of course, before we get to the composition of the world soul, is the composition of the world body, because we're already talking about proportionality there. It comes up in the composition of the world soul, but also importantly, very importantly, when we're structuring the elements. Now, is there something that all three of these have in common? Is it proportionality, question mark? Or is it possibly an extensive notion of harmony? And this is also something, the notion of harmony occurs in this range of papers. But can we say that the focal point, the focal meaning of harmony would be in music? And then, the other notions of harmony are sort of related to that. But in which way are they related to that? Or is a generic one proportionality, and is music harmony a specific form of proportionality? So if you look at Christina Honig's paper on Chalcidius in the volume, she treats basically the general issue of proportionality in Chalcidius's commentary, right? So it's not just in terms of music, but in terms of how proportionality functions in the entire structure of the world. And then we look at Giovanna Giardina's paper on Philoponus, but it's of course on Nicomachus' introduction to arithmetic, right? It's work on arithmetic. There we get a very general definition of harmony, namely as the relation between equality and inequality, between sameness and difference, between odd and even, the composition of which is harmony. This is not a specifically musical notion of harmony, I would say, but is it still the case that the musical one is sort of the core or the focal sense? The next question, of course, is to throw in, you know, the $1 million question in Platonism, but I think it's worth bringing it, reminding ourselves of it. What exactly is the ontological status of mathematics in the Timaeus? Clearly, it has some kind of intermediary role in the transfer of order from being to becoming. But how? And what does that actually tell us about the ontological status of the mathematicals themselves? According to a number of readings, this is an issue that really isn't resolved in the Timaeus. Now, there have been attempts to resolve it, mostly from saying that in the Timaeus forms are numbers, which is a reading that I don't endorse. I think the text is too underdetermined for that. And then also you have minimalist readings on being, you know, notably by Sarah Brody and Dorothea Frede, that really the forms are not that much in the picture in the Timaeus at all. Okay, so there are a couple of other issues that loom behind this, right? When we're talking about the status of this framework, of this mathematical framework. There is something that Chalcidius and Plutarch have in common, at least on some level, and I think they're representative of a certain approach to this. So Chalcidius, according to Chalcidius, the world soul is composed according to ratios, and he uses the language of congruere, convenire, or concinere. And then, of course, famously, Plutarch in his De Anima Procreatione, he rejects the notion that number is the essence of soul, with the critique of Xenocrates in a position that he attributes to Grantor. And in Laura Castelli's paper, and you know, again, a very sophisticated analysis of the ontological impact of mathematics, you know, that's the kata language, right? According to number. So maybe number can tell us something about what things really are, but it's kata, it's according to number. And so what does this tell us about the actual status of the numbers or the mathematics according to which something is ordered? Now, the intermediary status of mathematics is, of course, a key tenet in later Platonism. But again, it's worth reminding ourselves that for Chalcidius and Alcinous, even for Alcinous, the order of theoretical philosophy is mathematics, physics, theology, not physics, mathematics, theology. So once you get the order, physics, mathematics, theology, it becomes obvious that mathematics is the intermediary or a kind of transfer. So that order is, of course, very telling in itself. Now, there are several ways of trying to look at the status of this mathematical framework. I'm trying to keep it, my wording as broad, as generic as possible. What I'm struck by when I'm looking again at his later papers in the volume is you could look at, as you could say that mathematics are their own level of reality, well, sorry, are intermediary as they're having their own level of reality. I mean, we might think here of something like Plato's divided line. But what we get instead is that mathematicals manifest themselves differently at different levels, which is, of course, what later Platonists do. Everything is represented in every level, but in the mode, according to the mode of that specific level, right? So all of reality is present at every level of reality, but in the mode of that specific level of reality. So then we get Domenico Mera's paper, brings out very beautifully the correlation between the different levels of music and the different levels of virtue. And I think that works really, really well, that correlation. If we were to tease out some of the implications, if I were to put Domenico Mera's paper in dialogue with Carlos Levy's contribution, You could argue that in Dominic's paper, we precisely get a different kind of scale than the Stoic scala naturae. But also, I wonder whether this scale would be acceptable to Philo, because there is too much emphasis on continuity. I think one of the ways in which what Carlos Levi suggested, Philo is interested in music, because it's also dissonance, or the kind of radical transcendence. Of course, Philo too has a motive of becoming like God, but he's very careful about that notion. You know, he just doesn't forge ahead in an unequivocal way. So anyway, if the two of them, if Carlos Levi were here, I would have loved to see the kind of discussion across time on between these different modes of presenting the continuity of the scale. We see this very clearly again in Giovanna Giardini's Amphiloponis. Again, this is on a commentary text that deals with numbers. We get literally different levels of numbers, right? We have forms are numbers, are somehow strongly correlated to numbers. We get to noetic, the dianoetic numbers are mathematical entities, and the physical numbers. Stephen Gersh in his paper focuses on what he calls iconic theology in Proclus, in which mathematics seems to have a privileged role. But notice that that notion is by Proclus's own designations or indications, that iconic theology is said to refer both to the figures of the elements and the divisions of psychic substance. So in other words, here you have the combination of the ordering of the elements with the ordering of the soul, which is not something that we might immediately expect, but because, you know, to us these might seem very different, but clearly Proclus has grouped them together on iconic theology. And then Stephen Gersh also discusses how that mode of looking at God or at the divine relates to Proclus's other modes of looking at the divine. Then if I go briefly to Alexandra Michalewski's paper on Plotinus, which starts from, you know, the two levels of music, which are ultimately derived from Plato Republic 7. But what is interesting about Plotinus is that we do not find in Plotinus this pronounced mathematization, you know, according to the entire structure of reality. And hence she shifts her focus, I mean, I think is a really interesting analysis to the notion of rhythm. And she talks at great length how rhythm can be related to form also in the tradition. You know, there's the arithmistos, even as it is used by Aristotle, and its relation to substantial number, right? And what is interesting here, what I didn't see in any of the, what I hadn't really paid that much attention to, but it was really striking that Plotinus uses rhythm to capture the dynamic aspect of the intelligible level of forms as life, and in their production of the lower levels of reality, right? So it's not some kind of static mathematical structure. It's associated with life and with production. And she thinks that that's what the association of rhythm and form is supposed to bring out. But all right, so if we have mathematics manifested differently at different levels, then I'm sort of scratching my head and I'm thinking, does this solve the problem? Because it seems that we are merely superimposing now a mathematical framework on the structure of reality. So if one way to look at the structure of reality, let's call it, for brevity's sake, a theory of hypostasis, in whichever form, a theory of different levels of reality. And then we have mathematical framework, but in a way that still doesn't quite explain the status of the mathematical framework, unless we accept the strong thesis that the forms are numbers, period, because then in the forms we would have the coinciding of the different levels of reality. That would be the point where they really merge into one another. Now, the final point that I would like to raise for our discussion, is there a specific function of music as opposed to the other branches of mathematics? Because if we're talking about the notion of proportionality that that covers all branches of mathematics. If we're even talking about an extended notion of harmony, if we're talking about a kind of mathematical framework that maps the order of reality, then we can ask ourselves, what is the specific function of music? What is it that it specifically brings to the table? Because we could argue that in terms of ontology, theology, cosmology, and epistemology, all of those functions it shares with the mathematicals in general. So that leads me to the question whether soul, I'm obviously talking here in sort of Neoplatonism lingo, that's why soul is capitalized. Soul is the privileged realm of music. Is that the case? Even if it's manifested at other levels too, right? That somehow soul is, that's the primary localization of the musical harmony. And of course, there's a lot in the Timaeus to suggest that, but then there's also, the battle over the definitions of the soul as self-moving number. But of course, that's number, not quite music. I'll turn to Harold Tarrant's paper in a few minutes, but there, he picks up on the Pythagorean view where music is central to physics and ethics. So not just any kind of ontology, but specifically physics and ethics, that kind of combination. So is that the case, that soul is the privileged realm of music? Or should we also say that the privileged role or the focal role of music is its ethical function in taming the irrational components? And then, of course, I'm thinking about the whole idea of the human soul modeling itself after the world soul. But the world soul, of course, doesn't need to tame any irrational components. So that issue would only exist at the level of the human soul. So at the level of soul, music is the expression of the order, the mathematical order as it manifests itself in soul. In the human soul, it would have the additional function, the ethical function in taming the irrational components of the soul. And that's also why, we find this, this is brought up in Alexander's paper, but time and time again, that music helps particularly human beings, and mathematics help human beings to turn towards the intelligible realm. But again, is there something specific about music and not just about mathematics in general? Now, there's one paper that I haven't talked about and haven't forgotten you, Harold. Last but not least, I'll briefly discuss Harold Tarrant's contribution on Porphyry's commentary on Ptolemy's harmonics. The gist of the paper is really on the riddle that is Porphyry. So he's trying to argue that this is an earlier work, and in a very kind of provocative way, that in this work, Porphyry does not so much present himself as a Platonist as such, but rather more broadly as a Pythagorean, or at least as much, if not more Pythagorean than Platonist. And he sees a connection here with Thrasyllus. Now, behind this, of course, is the, and I know this because I've had to battle with Porphyry myself quite a bit, is this, how horrendously difficult it is to pin Porphyry down. But I take Harold here to go further than Marcos Ambon's in his work, where Marcos said, there are a lot of Middle Platonist elements still preserved in Porphyry. Harold pushes even against that by saying, well, maybe it's more broadly Pythagorean. There is no specific or distinctive Platonist commitment as such yet. How can we see this? Well, we can see this in a couple of aspects of the work. It has a logos theology, so nous is not as central as in Philo of Alexandria, when we're talking about the cosmos managing divinity. Or we can see this in use of intelligible, namely it's used in senses that are not specifically Platonic, that could be endorsed by a number of schools. Okay, so that's about what I wanted to say. Yeah, I just wanted to reopen. Hopefully these questions can help us also for the discussion afterwards. Because, George talks about the analogy model of music, but again, that sort of conjures up what is exactly analogous to what here. I mean, it's all that entire kata language that I was referring to earlier. And yeah. So to summarize briefly, you know, this started with the treatment of the musical ratios in relation with the overall world of mathematics. You know, do they have something in common? Is harmony, is it the primary focus in music? And then it gets sort of extended. What is the ontological status of mathematicals? And because, you know, in order for them to be able to pick out something that of the structure of reality, and then is there a specific function of music as opposed to the other branches of mathematics? And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Gretchen and George, for these very generous presentations. And I'll open immediately discussion. Let me just add that, well, first, Alexandra should be with us now. And well, one thing which is, I mean, very much welcome is that also in these presentations, the two levels or approaches we wanted to express in our book are preserved. I mean, there is a narrative, so papers which cover different periods or times, and then there is a synoptic approach, and it is very, very, I mean, it is a great satisfaction for us to see that both approaches stand together and contribute to discussion. So there are many things, I'd say, which have been proposed by these presentations. So if there is anyone who wants to ask questions or provide feedbacks or remarks, I would ask to anyone to write the name in the chat so that we can just coordinate the discussion. Of course, this refers also to the authors. What I find particularly stimulating is exactly this notion of analogy, since I agree that there is this level, and at the same time I find it quite puzzling, as Gretchen said in the end, to get the actual role music or harmony has within reality. To what extent it is a constituent aspect of reality. Even though it isn't the essence or something, even the structure of something can be fundamental for the organization of reality. And all papers contribute a different focus on this issue. What I can personally discovered by reading the chapters of this book was exactly that one has many different readings of the relationship between harmony and reality, closer or less close, but anyway, it is something which provides in a very strong sense a key for reading reality. So I could expand on this, but I see that Elisabetta Cattani has a question. So please, Elisabetta, thanks.
So, thank you very much. I have a very small question. I haven't yet read the book, obviously, but I see that two dimensions of music are good represented in the book. The dimension of the nature of music, or mathematical nature of music, and on the other hand, the dimension of the knowledge of the perception of music. Is there any place in the book for the dimension of playing music, of doing music, and consequently, is there any place for the relation between music and techne, art? Thank you very much.
I would leave, the authors or readers or answer this question, and then maybe we can just talk about this. There is a whole story indeed between this issue, but I would leave floor to other people. Dominic, please, and Harold then. You're muted, Dominic.
Okay, perhaps Harold first. I don't know. Okay, well, since I'm talking, I might as well talk about audible music does occur in the volume. At least to mention the authors that I discuss in my paper, audible music is, so to speak, the lowest level of music, and it involves instruments, preferably the lyre. You know, if you want to be a good musician in the Pythagorean style, you should use a lyre. Maybe a guitar might be possible also. And then I think you have to obey the rules that Plato lays down in the Republic. It's got to be the right kind of audible music. So there is a place for it, so to speak, at the lowest level of philosophical activity, where you're educating people through audible expressions of rational structures. Okay.
Thanks, Dominic. Harold?
Yes, I must confess that I learnt the oboe myself, which I suppose is the modern equivalent of the aulos. So obviously I come from the wrong school as far as that is concerned. But what I thought it was worth pointing out was that the papers came from this conference originally entitled the harmony of reason. So if there's a heavy emphasis on harmonics one way or another, then as opposed to music as perhaps we understand it in our ordinary life, as opposed to our academic life, then that's probably partly applicable to the fact that the press decided to get the title changed midstream. So I believe there are a couple of references to the harmony of reason in my paper that actually are still there as a result of the title of the original conference. But so there was bound to be something of an emphasis on harmonics, and I must admit when looking at Porphyry, once again since writing the paper, in the light of reading more about Ptolemy, I was sort of amazed that Porphyry's commentary sort of went halfway through the Ptolemy and didn't get on to Ptolemy's third book, where he actually starts relating his theory of mathematical harmony to harmony in the soul and harmony in the cosmos, the things which you would precisely think would interest a Platonist most. But anyway, if people bear in mind the origins of the book. That will probably explain a little bit there. And indeed, perhaps why some of us chose one title rather than another. The other thing I would like to point out is I contributed to a volume once on philosophy and medicine, and felt constrained to point out how in a particular period it was much more the philosophers who were using analogies from medicine than the other way around. And I suspect that the philosophers were much more more keen on using musical analogies and so on and so forth during the period covered by this book than the musicians would have been wanting to use anything from philosophy.
Thanks, Harold. I think this is quite a crucial point indeed. I mean, and this is revealing of what one might call the Platonist bias in a sense. With Platonists, I mean the very wide category of what came into Platonism at a certain stage. And this is particularly interesting in my view, because if one reads the very good specialistic books on music in late antiquity, of course we have the Aristoxenian side or executive side, which of course was alive and important. And then there is the other side, that is the philosophical view of music, which of course has a very different perspective on execution and so on. And I would also add that there are then weird authors, such as my dear friend Theonos Myrna, who have to negotiate with these dimensions, and this is puzzling indeed for them. I have Mate on this, and then I have a couple of questions. Please.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to mention in response to the question that the contrast between a sort of theoretically laden techne and the practice of music is indeed an important issue in my chapter, insofar as Sextus says that the putative science of music is the target of his arguments, and that he implies that these arguments, if they are successful, have no implication whatsoever for organic and empiria, the everyday practice of instruments. Now, there's a further question whether we can take him at his word, just because he says so. But he seems to imply, at least in this context, that there is a kind of non-dogmatic, theoretically pure form of music. So, thank you.
Yes, thanks, Mate. So I have a question by Stefano Maso, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I would like do a special greeting to Gretchen, George, and Giovanna Giardina. Well, my question is this. Is not a condition of standing. We are an evolution. And I think that is a cheap on this question.
Stefano, maybe there's some the connection.
Condition.
Stefano, apologies. Probably there is some issue with the connection. So at least I missed the first part of your question. Probably everyone has. Could you
Can you repeat?
start again the question? Yes, please.
Okay. My question is, become from this consideration, the model, the musical model is not a static model. And then I think that there is an interesting connection between the theme addressed in Timaeus between order, harmony, and disorder, disharmony. Music is ever a condition, a situation in which we translate from disorder to order, from a musical note to another, to obtain a result very, very, very harmonically harmonized. I don't know if in the Neoplatonic is very important this evolution is no static model. Is there someone that addressed this question in ancient tradition? Question that for example, idea that in ontological research, the result of perfection is harmony, but there is not disharmony necessary to obtain harmony.
Here again, I'd leave the floor to anyone wanting to reply. There is, if I may, waiting for anyone who maybe wants to join. If I got correctly question, there is something important or telling at least in Plotinus 4:7, 8, and especially 8:4 with the apex. It is Plotinus' criticism against the soul harmony argument. And if I'm right, but I mean, maybe I'm entirely wrong, Plotinus objects that exactly that it is impossible to produce harmony from something which is disharmonious, which is exactly, at least as I see it, what many Middle Platonists wanted to argue, at least, of course, Plutarch, Atticus, and people like this. And probably this depends on the fact that Plotinus saw the issue there. So, I mean, so the issue, the potential issue of making harmony just as a, well, in that case, soul, just as an emerging property of the harmonic soul. But I'm not certain that in that case, Plotinus' argument implies that you cannot have just harmony of the soul. Of course, the contrary is the case. So it is, of course, a very hard question, but still a question which is asked in the tradition. Dominique, please.
Sorry for speaking again, but I think the question is very interesting. And I just have a few reflections about it. I think I'd like to distinguish between harmony and symphony. And let's say harmonia is adjusting things to each other. And symphonia would be when they concord in the modern sense of harmony. And so if ancient harmony is arranging things. They can be arranged in various ways. And symphonia is a sort of a norm. The right harmony is, let's say, the octave or the fourth or the fifth. In the talking just about the Neoplatonists, if I may, I think disharmony probably is best found in the sensible world, in the irrational, the chaotic, that is put into some sort of order. So we could say this: the sensible world is a beautiful result of imposing order on disorder, or it's a symphony created from the matching of order and disorder. So maybe there is a sense there of disharmony and being part of reaching consonance, harmony in the modern sense. But perhaps I can get some help on this. Thinking of the higher levels, it's a little harder to see how this sort of thing might happen. That soul is a symphony, let's say, which means the putting of order into disorder. Is there some sort of disorder in the making of soul, which is put into order, and therefore a harmony comes out of lack of harmony? I don't know. Perhaps other people have ideas about that, whether some answer could be given if we go above the sensible world.
Yes. Thanks, Dominic. We have George and then Gretchen, probably.
Two thoughts on that. Namely, while I was sort of reading the book, I found it, and I now find it also very interesting and relevant, that the focus of the book, but also not unjustly, but also of the ancient discussions, is not on the musicians, namely on those who produce music. The focus is on the effect on music, and the effect is by definition an effect of success, something successful. So music is by definition something harmonious, orderly, rational, right? So we don't really speak of music that potentially is disharmonious or irrational or whatever. Of course, there are kinds of music and sort of more or less pleasant, but the general idea, I think, and of course I speak dialectically because I don't know the treatises music well, but the general idea, and I think on which the book capitalizes, is that music as harmony is something that has connotations of success. And I think it is exactly that what sort of Dominic has just stressed, that sort of success is the effect that we also recognize in the sensible world, despite some disorder like sort of, I don't know, earthquakes and other natural disasters. The overall structure is that of success, of order, of harmony. And one more sentence, I couldn't help playing with the idea that this very sort of dominant presence of music in that era, namely in the Roman philosophy, or however we call it, sort of later ancient philosophy, somehow replaces a dominant analogy that we find in earlier philosophy, that of medicine. In Plato, Aristotle, we find sort of this as a sort of a major analogy, but this analogy now is somehow that of music, as which with ethical implications, with ontological implications, with epistemological implications. So people seem to be aware that this analogy somehow works very well in different areas of philosophy, and they sort of consciously make use of that.
Thanks, George. Gretchen?
Yeah, I think, Dominic, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're drawing attention to the point that in Platonism, order does not presuppose disorder. In fact, in a way, it's the other way around. I mean, you can only understand disorder as a deviation from order. But you know what is, for instance, striking, and I think this goes back to the point that Federico made. You know, in the earlier layer of Platonism, you have this disorderly soul, so that you know, in the case of soul, at least, you can go from a state of disorder to order. But that's an idea that, of course, does not get carried over in the later analyses. So at least on the level of soul, you could have the transition from disorder to order. But I think ultimately, you know, if you want to make soul, the closer you want to bring the principal soul to perfection, to the intelligibles, the less likely you're going to be to engage in that kind of thinking, I think. Right.
Thank you, Gretchen. So we have, if there aren't any other follow-ups on this, we have Sebastian Moro-Tornese, who has I suppose another question or a follow-up on this. Please, Sebastian.
Well, thank you very much, and congratulations for the volume. And yes, my question and comment is related to this topic because it's also related to the very early notion of harmony in Philolaus that is also appearing in Proclus' commentary on the Timaeus about Peras and Apeiron, and harmony is the way of connecting those. But for Proclus, Peras and Apeiron is also connected to the Orphic theogony, that is two elements of ether and chaos. So this brings back to the idea that even the world soul has a therapy to do in its own level, because I wanted to comment on something that Gretchen said, that the world soul doesn't need to tame the irrational, but I think that it has something to do, because there is some therapy also that the world soul is doing. And Proclus presents the analogy of Apollo and Dionysus. Apollo is the medicine god and the musician god that needs to heal the Dionysian division and the titanical division. So those are cosmic aspects too. And another comment that I wanted to do is that this is related probably to the function of music as connecting levels, and related to the, as also Gretchen said, intelligible life in the second movement of permanence, prohodos and epistrophe, and the life of the intelligible world is related to music and this dynamism, and it connects with number 2, because Nicomachus in the Theologumena Arithmeticae says that arithmetics correspond to number 1, music to number 2, geometry to number 3, and astronomy to number 4. So this number 2, I think, is the key to understand the specific function of music, and also its connection with time, because time appears as space only in astronomy, but time as life in the soul that connects the Dionysian division is the integrative principle. And I think it, one last comment, it connects with negative theology, because the iconic theology only deals with all these levels that are divided. But when we need to return to unity, we need to negate all these iconic presentations. And this is possible with apeiria. Apeiria is the infinite. With entheurgy is connected to, even with the lowest levels, we have a theurgical use of those levels. Those are my comments.
Please, Gretchen.
Yeah, I'm going to reveal my ignorance, or at least not having the relevant material at my fingertips, but it's precisely the connection between music and time that makes me think that the privileged realm is at the level of soul. Right?
Any further comments or replies on this point, very interesting point by Sebastian? So we have in the chat 2 questions. One has been left by Svetlana Griffin before she left, since she had to teach, but she was kind to leave it here, and I would read it for you. And in Plotinus 5:9:11, Plotinus distinguishes specifically a techne of music and a techne of intelligible number, separating them from the other kinds of arts. Plotinus' understanding raises the question of the relation between number and intelligibility. And now, of course, I forward to everyone, to everybody, the question about concerning the relationship between number and intelligibility. In fact, what the passage, Gretchen, if I get it right, intelligibility here, I mean, possibility of grasping the issue. Of course, there is an original relationship. If we consider the passage of the Timaeus, Gretchen quoted at the beginning, so at the end of the Precosmos passage. But well, maybe Alexandra is great, please. You're muted, Alexandra.
You hear me? Okay? Okay, thank you very much. So thank you very much, Federico, for inviting me in this meeting. And I'm really glad to maybe answer Svetla. Indeed, there is tight connection in the Plotinian text between that is my hypothesis, so it's just my opinion, between rhythmos and arrhythmon. So on my opinion, on the manuscripts are not really sure about how we can decide in these Plotinian treaties if there is intelligible number or intelligible rhythm. In my opinion, it is quite the same meaning at the end, because rhythm indicates in some way the rational regularity, but also vitality of the deployment of what intelligible forms are for Plotinus, that is intelligible on living realities that develops according to some rational structure, on having a harmonical relation each other, and also which the bodies which depends on it. So in my opinion, that is a special meaning of this point that Svetla has raised, but it's just my hypothesis. Okay.
Thanks, Alexandra. Any follow-ups on this? We also have another question by, read it as I see it, Lele, who maybe is still with us. So I would invite her or him to ask the question, or if there is any issue with the line, I can just read the question which is on the chat. Please let me know how you prefer to proceed. So please, perfect, Lele. You prefer me to? Oh, perfect. Okay, so I'll read the question also for the sake of the recording. The function, the purpose of making a mood harmonious. What is this harmonious makes an effect, like the order of empty and full that establishes a harmony. It will be important to know how to have documentation of when the disharmonies were used in the same context of a musical composition, of which one could have a score. Happy notes, happy musical atmospheres, and as well sad ones. Disorder is an expression, isn't it? And this is actually, in fact, for me at least, a huge question. So I ask anyone, if anyone has a reply to this.
Hi, everybody. Did I recuperate the audio?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. So the point is that tempo, the time and tempo in music is not as well writable as the harmony of notes, you know, as the musical partiture. So you know better than I that in jazz we can't write the jazz. Jazz doesn't exist as a writable music because all supposition from where you heard before and suggestion. And so I am very interested on what could be the transmission of the sense of tempo in music, the rhythm, because we can write, we can suppose what is harmony by the writing of time of different eras, you know. But all this is from the curiosity about what you know, that tempo changes. You can play a tune. One time is one day is sad, one day is less sad, a little bit glad, and you can play that in different time and not always at the same tempo. This is from jazzing, you know, as well, by the fact that harmony and disharmony create an effect as well in music, as well, and like the tensions in literature as well. And I think they're very important, these two elements in the ensemble, you know. We talk about symphony, we talk about harmony, and these are two elements very important of the composition, as well like the tension in literature, dark literature or something like that, you know. That's the point. The point is the relationship, the important relationship between disharmony and harmony for me.
Thanks for this question. So I have Harold. You're muted, Harold.
I'm here. That's better. Okay. Yes, I had Ravel's Bolero going through my mind there, getting faster and faster and faster, which of course is something that that great harmony in the skies can't do. It always has to stay at the same time, even though as you get older, years seem to go by quicker and quicker. Now, it strikes me that the dynamism of music is very important, because we all know that that music goes through very brief periods of disharmony in order to get onto the next stage where and move on. And as it moves on, it goes through disharmonies in a harmonizing sort of way. But I just feel that for the most part, the kind of music that we were talking about in the volume is not where we should be looking for philosophic interest in the way things change. There's an awful lot of use in the philosophers of the image of a dance, whether it's a cosmic dance or some other kind of dance in which obviously involve a dynamism that mere talk about harmonics doesn't. And I wonder whether that shouldn't be the next subject of the next Pelosi, Petrucci volume.
And we have Pablo Massa.
Sorry, but I think that Harold said what I wanted to say much better than me. So I will stay with Harold. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. Gretchen?
Unless somebody else has a question, because is there anybody else at this point? Okay, Federico, I wonder, I know that, you know, your paper was in the first half commented by George, but I wanted to, if possible, take up a question regarding your paper on the interventionist and non-interventionist modes of harmonizing. And some of you may notice that Federico have been going sort of back and forth on a couple of things. Some of it is hidden in the footnotes. I think it's more of a spectrum than you make it out to be. And here are my arguments for saying it's more of a spectrum. And I think I can put them on the table succinctly. So, you know, you put Apuleius on the non-interventionist side, but of course, one of the key differences between Apuleius and Aristotle's De Mundo is that Apuleius does introduce the notion of providence. So I think the moment you have providence, even if it's non-interventionist, you have a different kind of causality, you have a thicker notion of causality than without providence, right? So in a way that would link Apuleius, you know, with the other group. And or if an Alcinous, for example, what do Alcinous and Numenius have in common? This idea of the lower world soul that needs to be woken up. And I agree with you and Jan Opsomer and others that Alcinous, of course, is very much on the end of the spectrum of the non-interventionist spectrum. It's as close as you can get to the unmoved mover. But even there, if you look at the attributes that are attributed to the gods in chapter 10 of the Didaskalikos, you get a line that says he has filled the entire universe with himself. I mean, how is a detached God supposed to do that? So, so I look at these more as a spectrum or a way, or struggle, which they make different choices or emphases on the more noetic or the more relational aspects of the divinity.
Thanks, Gretchen, for this question. And I would tend to agree with you in the sense that if we consider the spectrum in absolute, so the most, the strongest possible model of providence, we don't have, I don't know, Plutarch on the extreme, since we have the Stoics. And we don't have Apuleius or Alcinous on the other extreme, since we would have there Aristotle or some peripatetics and so on. If we restrict the spectrum within the Platonist tradition, I think that what some Platonists, I mean, Apuleius, Alcinous, and so on, are trying to do is to say, well, we are Platonists and we need providence. I mean, providence is what distinguishes us from Aristotle, for instance. But we don't want either a stoicizing kind of providence. And of course, Atticus does the opposite. So he says, I want to side with the Stoics and not with Aristotle and so on. So they try to preserve providence. So a certain kind of intervention of divinity within the word, but also they want to limit issues deriving from a stoicizing model. So it is true that Apuleius has providence, but it has that weird mediated providence. And I suppose Apuleius would never say God everywhere arrives within the word, which is a passage of the laws, which Atticus, for instance, quotes. He would say, as he says in the Apologia, if I'm right, that demiurges are sine opera artifacts, which doesn't imply that providence doesn't exist. It implies that it exists, although God is a sine opera artifacts. The point is, in my view, and this maybe depends also on my reading of Timaeus, is that the business for stoicizing Platonists or temporalist Platonists, Plutarch, Atticus, and so on, is much easier from a textual point of view. Since Plato speaks about a demiurge, speaks about pronoia, and so on. The business of Taurus, Celsinus, Apuleius is to produce an account of a non-interventionalist or indirectly interventionalist God by using interventionalist words, images, descriptions, and so on. And this does produce a sort of tension. They have to say that God is a demiurge, since God is a demiurge for a Platonist. But it isn't a demiurge as Plutarch's demiurge, and so on. And I think that this is the puzzle for these authors as well. So it is a true tension which is present in these authors. As I don't know whether this was.
Yeah. Then as I expected, to actually pretty close in the views. By the way, if I just may briefly, the pronoia is not all that prominent in the Timaeus. I mean, we tend to, because of the later reception, and I don't just mean that the word itself gets mentioned only once, but there is so much emphasis also on the limits of what the demiurge can do in the Timaeus. But anyway, that's a different issue.
It is. There is also there's a follow-up, and this is a problem with translation, in fact. So while translating the Timaeus, and the issue is whether one should translate pronoia as providence, in fact, since there is, if I'm right, he uses twice the word, but once is for the gods, pronoia, and the other time is for vision of people. So the fact that the demiurge provided people with the capability of looking in a certain direction, which is quite puzzling. I mean, I found a solution in the Italian translation, which is forthcoming next year, with the help of some students, lungimiranza, for the human beings' way of seeing. Well, it's a huge issue. Thanks, Gretchen. So we are at the limit, in fact, of our meeting. I don't know whether there are any further questions or remarks. Dominic?
Okay, just a few remarks, if I may. Coming back to things that were said by Gretchen and Harold, I think what Harold said is important, that you need to organize something on dancing, because there are two aspects. You might say there's the aspect of pitch and the intervals between notes, and that's, so to speak, a static aspect, especially in the Neo-Pythagorean mode. You're talking about relations between intervals. And then the other aspect is rhythmos, what Alexandra has very well shown with respect to Plotinus. And you might say that's the diachronic aspect as opposed to the synchronic. And so the intervals for music, we would say, are important in their development, in the way they're resolved or not resolved in audible music. And so rhythmos is just as important almost as arrhythmos. And one gives you the dynamic, while the other gives you the static. And in a way, to counteract the perhaps overstatic impression that Neo-Pythagorean music can give, to counter it, you can bring in dance, and that sort of dynamizes the whole thing. Just responding quickly to a question that Gretchen raised, if you talk about the Neo-Pythagorean way of seeing things, as that is from Nicomachus on, music as a theoretical science, harmonics, deals with the relations between numbers. So the primary science is arithmetic, the science of numbers, and then it's followed by harmonics, which is the science of the relations between numbers. So music is actually a projection or a development of arithmetic. It's not some kind of side discipline. And then arithmetic itself, in the Neoplatonic version of these things, arithmetic itself, its objects, numbers, are constitutive of soul. They are ousiodais logoi, and they themselves are images of forms. So it turns out, in fact, that arithmetic is just a stage, so to speak, in the expression of logoi, and music is a further stage. And so you bring the whole thing back to forms, and then, of course, you can go even higher up. So music is not some kind of supplement or side discipline. It's actually right in the center, but it's part of this derivation of all things from the one ultimately. And at music, you're dealing with one level of this derivation. So it's absolutely central. And it's, if you want to say where music is, you could say it's in the soul, because soul is itself a musical structure. But of course, that's not the end of the story. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. And Elvira.
Thanks a lot. Okay, so I have a question, which is not really a question, it's more a curiosity, I think. So I was wondering whether you think that when in the authors which are discussed in the volume, we can find accounts on what sound is. So sound as something which, like sounds as items which compose music. So music is made of course, when we talk about harmony and melody, we talk about numbers and the way in which music evokes some specific emotions by the way in which music is structured, namely in a rational way, right? Because there are some intervals which are based on a specific sequence of overtones, right? So I was wondering whether these authors, because I know that at least Aristotle, he had a view on what sound as something which is the basic element of music. So sound also taken as like a simple voice or just the slamming of a door. So sound is taken as a sort of basic element of auditory experience. So if these authors also have in mind, has maybe at least, they have some conception of what sound in a metaphysical sense is. And then of course, when you talk about music, then you have probably a different conception of harmonized sound. So my question is, like, I think it's more a curiosity than a proper question. Thanks a lot, Federico.
Thank you, Elvira. Anyone on this? Harold. You're muted, Harold. Harold. Harold, sorry, you're muted. You're muted. Great.
Terrible, isn't it? I've been doing Zoom so much lately that I forget how to unmute myself. This is Ptolemy. The definition of sound given: sound is an attribute pathos of air that has been struck, the first and most inclusive kind among audible things. So obviously the definition of sound is something that belongs both to music and to philosophy, when the philosophers try to give an account of hearing, I believe. So there's plenty there, but I guess most of us were trying to build upon something that where music had become a subset of sound, if you like, a particular kind of sound. That's all I was going to say.
Thanks, Harold. Pablo, if it is a follow-up.
Hello. Concerning the material qualities of sound, sorry that I don't give video, but I'm better at dark screen. I look better as a dark screen. I'm not presentable. Concerning the material qualities of sound, Boethius, in a later stage, says that sound is a movement of things, and sound, it's an interval, can be measured as the ratio between the movements of two objects. In those times, they didn't know the concept of frequency, but they described the material quality of sound as movement. They had no measure, they had no instruments to measure the quantity of movement. But instead, they realized that that this difference between movements, between two sonorous objects, was reflected proportionally in the length of the two strings, for example. Two strings sounding at the same time moves differently in different speeds, at different speeds. They had no way to measure the real quantity of that movement, but they realized that the length of the strings and the proportional relationship between the length of those strings was a proportional relationship. So they were speaking of frequency avant la lettre, without, at least Boethius, I know that he talked about this. But the real material quality of the sound is movement and displacement of air, just as we know it. I hope that this is useful. Thank you.
Thanks, Pablo. And any other comments on this?
Federico, if I may.
Yeah, yes, please.
I would like to say something about the question raised by Elvira Di Bona, about the relationship between sound and musical sound. One of the most interesting chapters in the volume on this topic is Barker's chapter, specifically on the relationship between sound and musical sound, and between acoustic and music in Ptolemy. So this is exactly the topic of Barker's analysis in this chapter, and he highlights how this passage from acoustic to music means also a passage from, say, an analysis of acoustic qualities and an analysis which concern also evaluation, also some notion as pleasant, as nice and beautiful. So there's Barker shows how Ptolemy changed the perspective between an acoustic analysis and an analysis of sounds that are specifically musical. This is very this is explained very well in this chapter about Ptolemy and about this matter in Ptolemy's harmonics.
Thanks, Francesco. Any comments, follow-ups on these? It is partly, I mean, this is, in my view, a very important and telling aspect of the ancient debate on the reception of technical music among these philosophers. Since there are Platonists who you would not expect to recover Aristotle. They don't do so from many points of view, but then when they have to side against Aristoxenus, so against someone saying that sound is just quality, and someone saying that you cannot provide a quantitative account of sound, then they recover Aristotle and the Aristotelic tradition exactly in the way you described it. So you have, for instance, the Theonos, Myrna, but also other people who take Aristotle's account as a standard for the physical description of sound against empiricists. And in this way, they make Aristotle an anti-empiricist, which is weird, by the way, but this is the play of alliances in late antiquity, which is quite intriguing on this side. So we are now at even after our expected time. If there aren't any further questions or remarks, I would very much thank again our speakers, the authors who were able to part in this presentation, all participants, and again Cambridge University Press. So I would say also on behalf of Francesco, thank you to everybody. The recording will be available soon, and if you want to buy the book, of course, you can ask Michael for this. Thank you so much again, Francesco. I don't know whether you want to say anything.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
So, thank you so much, especially to George and Gretchen. And see you next week. If you want, if you want to book also for that, just write. If you book for the old series, well, it's even better. you will automatically receive the link with Gretchen's book on Chalcidius next Thursday.